I hope, and maybe I'm back into the same naivete we had in the early days of the cannabis industry, but I hope that if we can develop this as a therapeutic intervention, and I mean that in the broadest sense, I'm not saying it has to be a medical model. I think people, it is helpful for people long before they have, some sort of mental health crisis or diagnosis. So I want it to be available for people to use as preventative or use as, consciousness raising and wellness, support. But regardless, if we're, and also there's nothing wrong with it being a recreational substance too. I think, again, the safety levels on it are much higher, especially if it's being used in a safe environment, than alcohol, for instance. Um, but from a sort of industry perspective, and I almost hate to even use that word, from a field perspective, this is about therapeutic use in a way that makes a difference in people's lives and probably doesn't need to be done more than a couple times a year.
Yeah.
And that is a very different proposition than the daily use that, most cannabis consumers are on.
Welcome to People Are the Answer, and thanks for joining us today. I am so fortunate to have with me my friend Taylor West of Healing Advocacy Fund.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, it's great to see you. It's been too long, and
It has.
yeah, glad to have put this little Denver spot together so we can do some in-person stuff.
That's amazing. I'm excited.
Yeah, and we know each other from the cannabis industry, something you were involved in for a long time, which we can talk about. We've both worked on the policy side in that. And so, it's been years. We've gotten on and off opportunities to work together. So it'll be really cool to check in and kind of see what you're up to.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting last 5 years or so as I've sort of been shifting in some ways in a big way and in other ways in a very natural way from cannabis work into working on psychedelic policy. So there's been a lot going on since the last time we caught up.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, it's great to see the progress that's been taking place in psychedelic advocacy. I'm excited to dig in there, but I like to start with a difficult one. In life, generally, what would you say motivates you?
Whew, that is a tough one. If I'm being totally candid, I think I grew up being driven a lot by external validation. This is something I've been digging into a lot as an adult, learning how, as a kid, I was able to really get a lot out of people telling me that I did a good job or getting good grades, or, and it was in some ways really easy to check those boxes. And as an adult, those boxes get a lot less simple, a lot more complicated. And so it has been kind of a journey for me in the last 10 years, especially to try to understand what is it that motivates me that isn't that. Because when you start to rely on that and count on that, it can get you into some rough places as a grown up when people aren't sending you home with report cards. So now I think I am really motivated by um, challenging myself to do work that I believe will have lasting meaning. And those are big words that can sound sort of vague, but as somebody who's worked a lot in the politics and policy space, that has always been kind of the point of my of the work that I've done. And as I have gotten older, and especially in the last few years, I've realized that I can get very fear driven if I'm relying on external validation to make me feel like I'm doing good work. But if I notice why I've chosen to do the work that I'm doing and why I care about it and focus on that and let the scary parts work themselves out, that is a lot more effective for keeping me driven and motivated. So in recent times, I've really been trying to think about how much I believe in the larger goal of the psychedelic policy that I'm working on and the effectiveness of the organization that I'm leading, much of which effectiveness started before I came in. I can't take credit for I care a lot about supporting the continuation of that effectiveness, and that's really the thing that has kept me moving in the last year or so.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, hearing about like the external validation and stuff and fear, those both resonated with me. I feel like I those are things that I've had to work on as well. And it's just, I think our society, trains at least certain personality types to feel that way.
For sure.
And so, yeah, that takes a lot of effort, but to see that you've, pushed yourself to get to a different place is impressive. And I mean, certainly I'm someone that believes in the impact of the individual. People are the answer. Like, I know how impactful one person can be if they're dedicated to creating positive impact. Like, there's real change that can happen. So even if it sounds silly to some people, it mostly only sounds that way, I think, to people who haven't experienced it firsthand.
I think that's right. And I can very easily slip into the focus of, oh God, what happens if I fail? And what does this mean about who I am as a person? And so trying to shift that around to, yes, that's scary, but it's worth it to push past that fear because if I succeed, that's really important to me. I'm achieving something that I really care about. Um, it's not the easiest shift for me, but that is what I am trying to work on right now.
Yeah. Well, love it. I look forward to digging in a few minutes into some more psychedelic stuff. But tell me about, your background, where you grew up.
Yeah. I grew up in a very small town in Southern Virginia, about 3,500 people, and a great kind of working class community, originally built around essentially around a furniture manufacturing company that was founded there and headquartered there for a very long time. And kind of a classic example of the sort of hollowing out of that type of industry in the country over the course of the 80s and 90s. It was a family owned business that was bought out in a hostile takeover in the 80s by a company that promptly went bankrupt and just took this, this company that had been the lifeblood of the town, and the family that owned it were the philanthropists of the town and all of that, and just kind of gutted it. And I am more aware of it because my dad worked there. He was actually the guy who basically turned out the lights when that company eventually left. They still exist as a brand, but no longer in my hometown. But it meant that at the time there was a solid kind of middle class that was developed by often people who didn't have college degrees and were able to, work a 9 to 5 job, and all of those things that we know, have kind of been lost in the last 30 years. Gosh, has it been that long? Um, but but a beautiful place, a very tight knit, small community. With a community high school that had 300 kids, and so it was the kind of place. It was a really lovely place to grow up, and also a place that I kind of knew right from the beginning was not going to be where I stayed. Lots of people do, and thanks to the mixed blessing of Facebook, we'll put it that way. I'm much more aware now of what a lot of the people I grew up with are doing, and a lot of them are there and building lives for themselves. But I always was kind of looking ahead to something bigger. I spent a lot of time going to what I call nerd camps, summer
I
programs
did a
that
few
were,
nerd camps
oh yeah,
myself,
oh, I
so.
loved my nerd camps. And it was great because it gave me the chance to meet other kids who were, had similar mindsets and things like that. Um, and so, from a fairly early age, I knew I was kind of looking ahead to what would be in the future. And I ended up going to college at Duke, which was like a 2 hour drive from where I grew up. So it was sort of far enough away and certainly a world away culturally from the town that I grew up in, but still able, to keep
But
those
still not
connections.
crazy far or
No,
anything,
no, I
like.
didn't feel like I had like relocated to the other side of the moon or something. And I should say, by the way, the other thing that I think was maybe not unique, but certainly special about where I grew up is that there were, and this gets right to your message, there were individual people in that town who really built things that were bigger than what you would expect in a town that small. And two key examples are, I took Latin from 8th grade through my senior year and eventually ended up doing some of it in college too. And the only reason that this tiny little rural school had this thriving Latin program was there was a woman who had grown up in our town, who had always been there, who was passionate about the classics, and she got her degree and wanted to be a teacher and taught Latin for years and years and years. And she never had kids of her own. She was single. This was just her world. And she pulled so many of us into it in a way that you wouldn't expect in a
Yeah,
small
and that
school.
that impacts a lot of
Oh,
lives.
it's crazy. And the other one, similar situation, was the band director at our school, also native to the town, also came back there, stayed there, frankly, stayed there against substantial odds because he was gay, but not openly gay at the time. But in a small town in Southern Virginia in the 80s and 90s, not the easiest place to kind of know that you're sort of skirting that. But oh, just so passionate about music and about the way that he brought in students who you would not normally think of as being like band kids. Um, those were like those were people who made a huge difference between kind of living in a sort of limited small town into something that really opened up horizons for people.
So, given growing up with people like that around, and I'm curious about your parents as well. Like, do you think that kind of made you interested in creating impact and doing things that gave back? And
Think so. My mom was a teacher for her entire career, mostly kindergarten, later some early elementary. And my dad, as I said, worked for this furniture company that was there um, for almost his entire career as well. And while I don't know that there was this drumbeat of explicit go out there and do something, impactful, I think there were 2 things. One, I think in a town that size, you're very aware of the interconnectedness, and things like class difference are both very visible and also not as divisive. And I say this, I should be clear. We were wealthier. I would consider upper middle class or whatever, that we grew up, but um we were certainly on the higher end of whatever the spectrum was in this very small town. So maybe my experience was different than others. But I think in a school that size and in a town that size, there's no kind of siloing yourself off based on your particular demographic or and so that sense of interconnectedness and that sense of awareness of difference and how other people's lives are different than yours, I think that was important. Especially, I became aware of that much more once I got to Duke, where a lot of the kids that I went to school with had never met someone who was on free lunch, and like a third of my class was, and it was just like something that was part of our day to day lives. Wasn't unusual. Um, and I became much more aware of that when I got into this environment where the vast majority of the kids grew up in much more privileged spaces. So I think all of that contributed to my sense that I wanted my work to have meaning, and what the way that I attached meaning was through policy.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it sounds like in your town there was kind of a proactivism, at least amongst certain people, that you could emulate. Whether you meant to or not, you were. And that's how your skills translated, is like doing so via policy.
Individual people
Yep.
helped kind of put meaning, and then I sort of translated that into policy.
Yes. So, you went from this small Virginia town to Durham, North Carolina, to Duke, and you've talked a little bit about what that transition was like. That there were kids that hadn't experienced some of the things that you had, and maybe didn't see as many things in their sheltered lives going in. how else was that experience, and like what got you to go in that policy direction?
Yeah. You know, I went into it knowing that I wanted to do policy, do because of public policy school. That was kind of what I, had intended. And I got really interested in sort of politics and policy while I was in high school. I guess one other piece of kind of uniqueness was that we had a really strong youth and government program. Actually, the Latin teacher and the band director that I just talked about both were sponsors for that
That's
program.
amazing.
So they were super meaningful in that respect too. And I learned a lot about the sort of idealized version of policy, which the more you work in the real world, the more you realize just how not realistic that is. But came into college knowing that that was something I wanted to do, and the program there is very good in that it's separate from political science. It's much more kind of less theory based and much more direct action based. And I think I learned a lot from that. It was also just a good opportunity to dig in on things like macroeconomics that I, had not really learned much about in high school, and understand how those things affect larger decision making. But I also would say a lot of my experience at Duke was about expanding my social experience in ways that I didn't necessarily get when I was growing up. And I think that's the flip side of the coin, right? There was a lot more diversity in all senses of the word where I grew up, but there was also a lot fewer opportunities to develop close relationships with people who cared about the same things that I cared about, or who were excited about the things that I was excited about. And getting to Duke meant certainly a much less diverse population in lots of ways, but it was also a lot of people, a lot of peers who were, academically inclined and excited to do big things in their lives. And so for me, that was really exciting
Yeah, it's
too.
like a different culture than you'd
Yeah,
experienced.
to feel like I wasn't kind of weird for that, for
Right.
having that perspective was nice too. Um, a lot of people talk about, especially at Duke, I think college in general, but especially at Duke, it's sort of 4 years of living in Wonderland. Like
Yeah.
you're very much in a bubble, and it's very, I think it's gotten even more that way. And it was, and I think by the end of my 4 years there, I was ready to leave the bubble. I was ready to get back out into something of the real world. But it was a special time for me to kind of expand my ideas about the people that I would find to connect with in my life, and the things that I could do, and the friends that I could make. In some ways, I think of my college experience as almost being, I did less in college in terms of extracurriculars and
Right.
all of that. I did lots in high school, sports and academic
Same.
stuff, and all of that. And I kind of got to college and was like, I don't think I need to do all of that stuff now. Like, I want to get good grades. I want to care about my studies, but like, I'm gonna go out and make friends and like
Yeah.
go to parties, and I think I had a nice balanced experience there.
Were you like conscious of that at the time? Because like for me, I also did way less of the extracurricular in college, but I don't even know if I was conscious of the fact that like, no, that's not what I'm focusing on. Like,
I don't know if I didn't go into it with the idea of, okay, I'm gonna do less. And I remember signing up for a few things freshman year where I was like, I'm gonna, do
yeah,
these all
same.
these activities. I think as time went by, I started to realize how nice it was to have unscheduled
Oh my
time
gosh. Yeah.
and take naps in the middle of the day.
Now we can look
Uh,
back fondly on those memories.
I know. Um, yeah, I don't know that I consciously went into it with that idea, but I think sometime fairly quickly I did notice that I wasn't feeling the urge to do a bunch of extra things. And then kind of realized, you know what? I might have been a little burned out from all of the stuff that I did. I think also there was that much less pressure to do all the stuff because all the kids there were, overachievers. And I was kind of like, all right, those overachievers are running for student government. Go for it. I don't need
Yeah.
to.
Yep.
Somebody else has got that covered. Um, So yeah, it was less conscious, but I think I did realize at some point fairly early on that this was where I wanted to take a little bit of a break.
So, all right, you got your degree at Duke in public policy analysis, right?
That's right.
And what was sort of the next step from there?
So I moved to New York with no real plan, other than that I wanted to get a nonprofit job, but I did not have one lined up. I moved up there with one of my best friends from college and just kind of threw myself into. I did some temp work for a little while I was applying for jobs, and eventually ended up with a kind of entry level fundraising, really like grant writing and that kind of thing, job with an organization called the Fortune Society, which is an organization that works with people who are coming out of incarceration. And they are primarily staffed by ex-offenders. So a lot of the support work that they do and all of the groups and things like that are largely run by people who have that background. But I was in the fundraising department, and it was, like I said, it was very entry level. I was doing a lot of data entry, of donations coming in. We got a fair amount that would come in as like small donations through the mail. But I also did some grant writing and, got a taste for that, or a taste of that. I wouldn't say I got a taste for it. So I did that for about a year. It was a great experience. And a really felt like a really meaningful way to kick off my career. I had spent time interning during college or over the summers with a drug policy organization. And so that general area of drug policy and criminal justice was something that I was really interested in. And so the Fortune Society worked nicely with that. I ended up leaving not just the organization, but New York, after about a year, because of a relationship that I was in at the time, and moved to Georgia, to Atlanta for a few years. Um, but if you go with me to New York, you will think that I lived there for 25 years because of the way that I'm like, oh, I remember this, and oh, I'm the worst about that.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, I was also there. I moved there in June of 2001. So I had been there for a few months. I had started my job by the time September 11th happened. But it was obviously a very interesting time to be there. And I think it's hard to compare because I was only there for a year overall and I'd only been there for a few months when it happened. So it's hard to say like how my experience was different because of it, other than to just really see how remarkably resilient the city was. My example for this is, the attacks happened in the morning. I stayed at my office until midday because we had internet, and that was one of the few ways I could communicate with people. Met up with my roommate. We kind of tried to figure out what to do, and we lived in Brooklyn, and by, I think, 3 o'clock that afternoon, we took our regular subway train home. Like, it was wild. I mean, it was a very packed train. It moved a lot slower. It passed, did not stop at a number of stations, but it got us home. Yeah, and it was just a very and even that, I think it was in hindsight that I was like, "Wow, that is amazing that one way or another, some portions of the city just kept moving." And it is amazing to imagine the ways that in lots of ways people kept that going. I mean, those are not trains that were being run by computer. This was people who were able to make that happen. But it also did just was a fascinating time to be there. Um, when I moved down to Atlanta, I was again moving. This is a theme for me. I just move places where I don't have jobs. Um, I really did. I had always wanted to kind of get involved more directly with politics. I'd been really interested in it for a long time, and right around the time that I moved to Georgia was this like massive flame out of the last bits of sort of Southern Democrats. At the time, Roy Barnes was this like big Democratic governor in Georgia, and Georgia had always had a fairly strong Democratic Party, but it was a very conservative Democratic Party. And that kind of went away starting in 2000. I mean, it started before that, but in Georgia in 2002, it finally really dissolved. The good news was that meant that everyone in the Democratic Party in Georgia at the time was sort of in a circular firing squad. And I, who had had no experience and no connection to it at all, was able to kind of slide into a job with the party, because I didn't have the taint of the collapse on me. Um, so that was my first opportunity to actually work in pure politics, and that's kind of how I got into campaigns, which was sort of the first third of my career, I guess you could say.
Got it. Okay, so you sort of paused on the drug policy, criminal justice reform stuff, went into campaigns, and
Did.
when drug policy and criminal justice reform first sort of got on your radar, like, was it just because that's where you were in terms of job, like you just ended up there, or was that an interest of yours?
It became an interest of mine in high school, going back to my nerd camps and youth and government stuff. I distinctly remember hearing a story on NPR, and this would have been 95, 96, about needle exchange and about how, or I guess the actual story was not about needle exchange, but it was the first time that more new AIDS cases, more new HIV cases in the country had come from intravenous drug use than from unprotected sex. And in the context of the story, I think they talked about needle exchange as one of the ways that advocates were trying to help solve for that. And I remember just being so struck by it. And then, growing up in a 3,500 person town in Southern Virginia, I didn't know a single intravenous drug user. Trust me. I mean, I didn't know of one. I'm sure there were people who were, but I didn't know about it. It was not a relevant
Right.
thing in my life. But to me, needle exchange became kind of symbolic of a policy that, if you look at it just from a purely rational and logical perspective, is so effective, and yet was so controversial and so difficult to make happen. And that became sort of my policy hobby horse for a while. And all of my youth and government stuff, I was doing your fake bills around needle exchange and that sort of thing. And so when I was in college, that first summer after my freshman year, I knew I wanted to do an internship in DC, and I wanted to do it around something that I was excited about. And I literally typed into Yahoo, not Google, because Google didn't exist yet. That's how old I am. Washington, D.C., and needle exchange. And a drug policy organization popped up as one of the results. And I emailed them out of the blue and was like, I'd like to come intern for you. And they were like, that's great. We don't have any money. And I was like, that's okay. I'll work for free. And there you go. I spent that whole summer and then the next summer working there. This will be a little niche for your audience, so you can cut this out if it's not interesting. But that's when I met Chris Lotlicker.
Oh, yeah.
We worked at that organization together, and it was right after my freshman year of college, and right after he had gotten kicked out of RIT for rabble rousing on campus about
Yeah.
drug policy. So Chris is the just departed executive director of MAPS, but before that did lots of drug policy work, and also, somewhere in there founded a renewable energy company. Um, but I did that work for 2 summers, and really went from needle exchange as this like interesting thing that I thought was a worthwhile policy, to learning about the concept of harm reduction as a philosophy, to learning about the drug war in a completely different way than I had been taught, as a kid. And really, that was a very impactful experience because it changed a lot of the things that I knew or thought about these kinds of policies. And I eventually gravitated, toward politics because I was curious and interested in sort of the strategic pieces of it. But drug policy was always there as
Yeah.
something I had, dipped my toe in a decently significant way early on. And then meeting Chris ended up paying all kinds of interesting dividends down the line, much later in my career.
When you came back to
To
drug policy.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, before we dive in there, I do want to just hear at least briefly about your political career. And,
Yeah.
I know you worked for various campaigns, among other communications roles.
Yeah, I ended up, without necessarily intending to, I ended up kind of specializing in working for Democratic candidates in purple states. My very first campaign was working for a Democratic candidate in Georgia, which was very much not purple at that point. And we really discovered the floor of the Democratic electorate in Georgia. But it was fascinating and I loved it. That was a Senate campaign. And then I sort of started the process of bouncing around, which really is what you do when you're working on campaigns. Every 6 to 8 months, campaign's over, you got to go find new work. And I moved from Georgia to Virginia, and I just very fortunately ended up in a role on Tim Kaine's gubernatorial campaign in 2005 in Virginia. And that was nice to come home and work in my home state. Also, Tim Kaine is to this day one of the most wonderful, decent, delightful people I have ever known. It was absolutely heartbreaking to me that he was part of the collateral damage of the 2016 election. But he is truly, uh, uh, there are very few people in politics who are as good as they might present. And I would say he's better.
Yeah,
Um,
those are hard to find.
Oh, he truly is a wonderful human being. Um, and from there, I kind of launched in. I did some Senate work, Senate campaign work in Virginia. Then I went to Iowa, did a gubernatorial campaign in Iowa. Then that led to me doing a presidential campaign in Iowa. Presidential, we'll call it. Chris Dodd was the candidate. And that one was a really interesting opportunity because while as a candidate, it became clear pretty quickly that we did not have much of a chance. I was able to have a much more senior role on that campaign than I would have if I had tried to get onto one of the bigger campaigns, which at the time we thought it was going to be the Clinton juggernaut, and then it turned out to be the Obama juggernaut. Um, but because I was working for a non-juggernaut, I was the communications director in Iowa instead of the deputy to the deputy of something. And it gave me a chance to build some really great relationships with consultants in the space, with media, and some of the people I worked with on that campaign are still some of my best friends in the world. I like to joke that when you're on a campaign like that, when it's over, you either are best friends forever with these people or you never want to see them again. And it's a really difficult campaign like that. You're either foxhole friends or you're like, that was the worst thing I've ever been through and I never want to be reminded of it again. Um, and then serendipitously, when that finished up, I ended up on a Senate campaign in Colorado. And that was really a big turning point from my personal existence. Um, I had never lived in the Mountain West before. I had only ever lived places where there was crushing humidity.
Likewise, yeah, that's why I
Oh,
haven't left.
I know. And I got out here and I was like, oh, this is why everyone spends all their time outside in Colorado. It's actually pleasant to be
Yes,
out here.
I felt the exact same
Ugh.
thing.
And I really did fall in love with it. When the campaign was over, I didn't have a good reason to stay. All of my professional work was back on the East Coast, my family, my friends, for the most part. So I did move to DC and spent some time working in various sort of roles in DC. But during that campaign, I met the person who's now my husband. We were not dating during the campaign. He's a bit younger than I am. And at the time, it, he was delightful and I very much enjoyed him and did not think of him at the time as a like dating prospect. But while I was in DC, we sort of reconnected and started dating at 2011. And after about a year of doing distance, where he was out here and I was in DC, we knew we wanted to be in the same place, and I was ready to get out of DC. I had a good experience there, but I felt like if I stayed much longer, I was going to be a lifer, and I didn't really want to be a lifer. And Colorado was calling. I had had it in the back of my head for a long time as a place that I loved living. So I joked with people that I was leaving DC and moving for love, but if love had been in Oklahoma, I don't know if I would have made the same choice. Maybe he would have moved to DC.
Right, right.
So that brought me
Yeah,
out
for love
here
of him and for
and for
Colorado.
Colorado.
Yeah.
Yeah. And once again, I moved to a new place without a job. And that sort of, that kind of concluded my politics career. But in short order led to sort of the now third, I guess, of my career, or no, second third of my career, which was in cannabis policy. And having moved here right at the end of 2012 and started working in cannabis at the end of 2013, right as adult use sales were about to start here.
And that was for the National Cannabis Industry Association?
That's right. And that's where Chris Lotlicker steps into the story again, because he had recruited Betty Aldworth away from NCIA to run SSDP. And the executive director of NCIA was kind of pissed at him for that. And so Chris called me, knowing that I had moved to Colorado and was still kind of trying to decide what I wanted to do. And was like, look, do you want to be the deputy director at NCIA? I can make some, introductions, and kind of brought me back into drug policy. So it sort of came full circle.
Yeah, Betty's a rough to have stolen because she's awesome.
Yeah,
So it was
exactly.
nice he had you to trade back at
That was his
least.
thinking. He's like, well, at least maybe if I offer up a replacement candidate, then I will balance out the karma a little bit.
And I mean, so that was 2013, you said.
End of 2013,
I
yeah.
got started in cannabis like beginning of 2015.
Okay.
So, what was it like then? Obviously like up and coming, adult use is just getting going. I'm sure it was hectic.
It was wild, and it was also so exciting and interesting. There's a lot of parallels right now between what that time was like and what it feels like right now in the psychedelic policy space. But it was still so small, and the people who had been working on it all kind of knew each other. I felt very lucky to step in at a time when so much work that had been done by so many people was coming to fruition. And I got to, in some ways, step into that at a moment when things had gotten where there were victories all around, and sort of benefit from that. And I'm very aware of how much work had gone on before I came into the space. But yeah, I mean, officially, my first day at NCIA was January 1, 2014, when legal adult use sales started in Colorado. So I was on site for the press and all of that. And yeah, especially that first year, it was a lot of it was hectic and exciting. It was a lot of communications work because there was such a spotlight on Colorado and Washington, but even more so in Colorado because Washington took about 6 months longer to get their program started. And it was really important that we made a good impression, right from the start about what this industry was going to be. And I was, in some ways, brought in. It was actually good and to the organization's advantage that I hadn't spent my whole career in drug policy. It was symbolic of the idea that now mainstream people were coming into this space, and it wasn't scary, and it wasn't, that I remember I sent an email to my entire media contact list, which at the time was pretty big because I'd been working in political communications for a long time, with the subject line, my new job selling drugs. And the open rate on that one was quite high. But the response was really exciting because I wasn't sure at the time if it was gonna be taken
I
seriously.
remember that vibe for sure, yeah.
Yeah. And my parents, even, I was a little nervous to tell them that this is what I was doing. I haven't said this explicitly, but maybe you can tell from the description of my, like, childhood and growing up. I was not a drug user of any kind. And if you went back and talked to people that I grew up with and told them that I've spent the last decade of my career working on legalizing drugs, they would have found that very funny.
Yep.
Um,
Same here. Same here. I mean, it sounds like,
yeah,
we both grew up in the South and,
exactly.
and anti-drugs and,
Uh-huh.
had our eyes open later. So, yeah.
Totally. And so it was really notable that the response that I got back from everyone was like, "That's so great. That's so cool. Tell me about how it's going." And that was really my job for that first year, especially, was to be responsive to media around what's happening with legal cannabis. But it was also just it's always tough to make the transition from idea to reality. Things get lost in translation a lot. And I think that's, we're seeing that in spades with the cannabis space right now. I don't think it's as bad as many people make it out to be, but it's hard, and it's not exactly what people had, imagined it might be, including me in that first year.
I
Yeah.
get that. I mean, I feel like a lot of people that got in, in like 2010 to 15 range, like are jaded, myself included.
Sure.
I think when adult use sales started in Colorado, that was like really what piqued my interest initially. As an entrepreneur, is like, oh, like, at that point I had tried and learned about cannabis a little bit and was like, knew that it wasn't a bad thing and that it was
Mhm.
a good thing in my experience. And so I was like, yeah, of course this is going to blow up and, start getting involved. And then so many headaches, such slow policy. I mean, for me, I quickly got onto the drug policy aspect of it because I just saw how important it was to end the war on drugs and was my eyes open to the atrocities of it. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us that got in around that on the business side are frustrated overall, and
Yeah.
there's not many people making tons of money. In that time, there were pockets of it
Right.
if you got in the right things, but so many of the people I know have some are still in it, some aren't, but they're they're
I
jaded.
mean, the business challenges are very real. They're driven by the policy challenges. The policy has not shifted as quickly as anybody expected, although if you spend any time around the federal government, you probably could have seen that coming. And I think there's very real disillusionment around how the industry has evolved. That was, early on, there was a real excitement around the idea that we could create something that was different. And boy, capitalism is a powerful force.
It's wild because I do remember those moments talking about like, can it remain this way? Let's keep the character of the industry starting with advocates, and it just happened so fast. Like everyone said it was going to happen fast, but then all of a sudden it had just happened.
Right, right. Yeah, it's tough. And I am deeply sympathetic to the disillusionment that comes from that. Um, and it is just an undeniable part of our culture, that is happening, especially in a place where that felt like there was a lot of money to be made. That just drives a lot.
You talked a little bit about with NCIA how you were trying to do things right. The industry was trying to do things right. I felt that way as well. Like we were part of a group that was like trying to execute this properly, professionally, respectfully, responsibly, to show that like the industry wasn't a joke and had some success in some ways, but because of the policy delays, and just the way our markets work, and seeing how like intoxicating hemp has like come into the picture, it's created such a conundrum in the space. Like for I think on my side, it's like let's make everything safe and regulated. Like let's put it through the system, let's put it through testing. But like because the policy didn't allow for it, like industry figured out how to use this loophole.
Right,
But
right.
now it makes the cannabis people look bad when they see like Delta 9 THC at the gas station.
Yeah, yeah. It's a tough one, and I have not been as following I'm aware of the intoxicating hemp debate, but I'm not as well versed on it since I haven't been working directly with it. But overall, this is the kind of bad policy that you get when the federal government can't get its act together to do anything.
So far behind the times too.
Yeah.
So
And this is, it is ridiculous and yet utterly predictable that Congress can't even fix banking when, what is it, 35 states now or maybe even more have regulated programs in their states.
I think
Um
it's more with all the medical these
it
days, but
probably
yeah, I don't
is, and
keep as
yeah,
close
I've
touch
been a
on
little
it either.
exactly. Um and you get bad policy results when there is conflicting, especially conflicting policy between state and federal. But I don't think that's on the people who made progress at the state level, right? That this is the only way to move things forward with any speed at all. And unfortunately, despite the demonstrably negative effects of the feds not catching up, they just continue to not catch up.
Yeah, I'm sure we could harp on that all day, but I want to learn more about your transition into psychedelics. I mean, I think, you mentioned earlier, like there's something similar about it, but there's something different about it, and that's how I feel around it. Like there's a lot of comparisons made between the psychedelic space and the cannabis space, and while it's like alternative medicine, there are similarities. Like it's also so different. It's such different consumption experience, such different use cases and frequencies of use. So it's also so different. And what has that been like?
Yeah. I mean, it's also just a very different model altogether, and it's very easy to make the analogy with cannabis because there are certain things that are similar. The state by state policy progress, simply because that's the only way we seem to be able to get this stuff done. And the challenges that arise from that, the conflict between state and federal, um, the fact that it is an illegal drug that is safer than most of the legal drugs that we have. Those are similar things. But when you start talking about at least what we're working on when it comes to regulated access for therapeutic purposes, the whole model becomes very different. And I think anybody who is making the analogy between cannabis and psychedelics as a business model is completely missing the boat. This is, as far as the work that we're doing, we're not doing retail at all. Right. Even if you did, like you said, the use cases and the frequency and all of that is completely different. Cannabis is a substance that many people use on a daily basis. I mean, I do. I take a
Yeah,
half a
myself
gummy
included.
every single night because I sleep so much better when I do. That means I am in a store every couple of weeks restocking my gummies. That's just not how most psilocybin consumption is done or how it's going to be. And in fact, if you're there's and people get off on the microdosing track,
Which
and
I think has its place and is
it
important,
does.
but also.
But you're talking about a much smaller, still, much smaller. There's just not the same. This is not a retail business model that we're building, and it's much more analogous to mental health care more broadly. It is a people services business to the extent that you're talking about it as a business model. And one of the things that means is that there is not the same profit potential. There is incredible potential for impact and for changing the way that we talk about and work with mental health. Yeah. But that's not the same as saying this is going to have some kind of hockey stick growth. And
Which maybe that's a good thing, right?
I
Because then we
think
don't have to
so.
worry about what happened in cannabis as much. I mean, I think some of it's already happening in terms of like the pharmaceutical industry trying to tap into it,
Sure.
but yeah, I mean, hopefully there's
Yeah.
some pros to that.
I hope, and maybe I'm back into the same naivete we had in the early days of the cannabis industry, but I hope that if we can develop this as a therapeutic intervention, and I mean that in the broadest sense, I'm not saying it has to be a medical model. I think people, it is helpful for people long before they have, some sort of mental health crisis or diagnosis. So I want it to be available for people to use as preventative or use as, consciousness raising and wellness, support. But regardless, if we're, and also there's nothing wrong with it being a recreational substance too. I think, again, the safety levels on it are much higher, especially if it's being used in a safe environment, than alcohol, for instance. Um, but from a sort of industry perspective, and I almost hate to even use that word, from a field perspective, this is about therapeutic use in a way that makes a difference in people's lives and probably doesn't need to be done more than a couple times a year.
Yeah.
And that is a very different proposition than the daily use that, most cannabis consumers are on.
If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard.
Now back to the show.
And when I think about sort of the pharmaceutical angle, like yes, they're in some ways they're trying to tap in, especially to some of this mental health model. I also think there is built-in incentive for the pharmaceutical companies to keep this from happening because I think we talked about healing, right? And I feel like so much of the pharmaceutical space is based on constant need of medication versus healing.
Yeah. It's a very difficult thing to plug into the pharmaceutical space in at least in the way that we envision it being done. And I mean, frankly, you could see that in the FDA's inability to wrap its head around an MDMA assisted psychotherapy concept. We are, in the pharmaceutical space as a country, we are very accustomed to drug being separate from anything else. You get a diagnosis, you get a prescription, you get the drug, and that's supposed to be the intervention. And the idea that this is a drug that, in and of itself, does not cure anything, but opens up the ability to have a more effective therapeutic intervention, I think is super exciting, but also so hard for our system to integrate.
It's really wild to look at our system and see how sort of separate mind and body are in our medical system.
Yeah.
It's sad, and like I think a lot of us realize that that's not good, but it's a hard system to push into.
Yeah. One of my most probably naive hopes for the work that we're doing at the state level is to help move us that much further down the line of recognizing how care needs to be integrated between physical and mental, and that the silos that our healthcare system has put itself into need to be broken in order for us to be more effective, especially when we talk about mental health care, but also physical health as well. This is one place where, and it's one of the reasons I get really excited about the state programs. I'm excited for FDA work and for the federal work. I think they are complementary pathways. I don't see them as conflicting, but I am excited about being able to build programs at the state level where they are designed explicitly with the idea that this is a drug assisted therapy concept. And that's not something we can do very easily through FDA, but it is something that we can do by building these programs at the state level and then using them as an example of success.
Certainly a lot of work to be done. And what initially drew you into psychedelic space, or how did you end up in it?
I often say I sort of backed into it compared to a lot of people in the space. I think a lot of people get into psychedelic policy and just the psychedelic sort of field altogether because either they've had a very powerful experience or they know someone who has, or they've seen it in a personal way. I actually initially got into it as the political side. I had been working on some cannabis ballot initiatives, and when Measure 109 in Oregon, the first psilocybin ballot initiative, started getting some traction, I was connected with some people who were working on that, and I started doing a little bit of advising on that. And I got to sit in on a focus group in Oregon with a number of people as they were sort of testing the messaging around this and to see if it had feasibility to pass. And I got to watch in real time people change their minds, and that doesn't happen anymore. I've been working in politics. I've sat in a bunch of focus groups, and even and it's gotten even worse since I was working in campaigns. People are so dug in on their positions that there's almost nothing that can change people's minds about most things these days. That's a whole other topic, that's a problem, but it is the reality we're dealing with. So to see a topic where people were open to learning new information and then adjusting their perspective was fascinating and exciting. Like, I thought I was done with campaigns because I was so tired of just feeling like there was little we could actually do. And then I see this issue where if we educate people about the research, about the safety guardrails, about the way this works, people were so hungry for anything to help with the mental health crisis that this was a place where they were open. And so I got really interested in it, and I started doing more work alongside the folks who were running that Oregon campaign. And then as I was doing that work, I got much more pulled into the larger sort of culture and field of the psychedelic policy world, and developed a lot of personal investment and belief in it from that. But it's sort of backing my way in, and that it started as this fascinating policy opportunity, and then became this much deeper, meaningful thing for me. And so when the Oregon initiative was successful, and like I said, I played a very small role in that one. I can't take much credit, but we knew we wanted to try to do it again quickly because there was a lot of momentum, and Colorado was a really obvious place to come next. So living in Colorado, I was very excited about that, and I ended up kind of helping to run that campaign. And since then, it's just been all psychedelics all the time.
Well, congrats on that campaign.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean it's awesome. Another reason I love living here is people are a little bit more open minded and willing to take some chances on things like this. And thank you for all your work and effort to move it forward.
Yeah, there's still lots of work to go, but we're expecting the first clients to go through probably by the end of April. So we're really close to launching here in Colorado. And in Oregon, we're already more than 10,000 people through that program. So, it's happening somewhat quietly. I think there's been a lot of focus on the FDA stuff and the, federal work and all of that. And like I said, that is important. But I think sometimes I want to just jump up and down and wave my arms and say, we wanted to start providing safe, guardrailed access, carefully designed access to psilocybin therapy, and we're doing it. It's happening right now in Oregon. More than 10,000 people have done it. There have been very few, we haven't had any major safety complications. It's certainly not perfect. There's lots of questions about, the model and viability, and whether, we need to make some shifts to make it more affordable. Certainly that's a drawback, but it's happening. And if it's happening there, we can start to have it happen in other places. And Colorado is going to start. I want to. I want to see by the end of 2026. I think we could have 50,000 people who have gone through a legal, regulated psilocybin therapy experience, and that's just I. That's to circle it all the way back to the very beginning. That's the thing that I focus on so that I get past my fear of failure. It's like, but if you don't fail, this is what's happening.
Yeah, tens of thousands of people's lives being likely deeply
Yeah.
impacted in a positive way. So it's really incredible.
Yeah.
And so I know you've worked with a few different organizations in psychedelics, but let's go right into Healing Advocacy Fund and how you got started there, what you guys are up to.
Yeah. So HAF was originally created in 2020 as it became clear that the Oregon initiative was going to succeed. There was a recognition that, passing it is just the first part. And now we have to, there's no one in government that has ever created a psilocybin therapy program, and very few people in government with any expertise along those lines. And so the goal with HAF was really to be the advocate for the success of the program, to be the organization that, to the extent that it needs to, holds policymakers accountable for sticking to the spirit of the initiative. But more importantly than that, to be a genuine partner to policymakers, regulators, others at the state level who do want to get this right but don't have the connection to the expertise and, all of that. So the organization was really built with that in mind, to be the support for successful implementation. And I was not directly involved with HAF at the beginning, although I was very much around it as it was being founded. Sam Chapman, who had been the campaign manager for the Measure 109 campaign, became the founding executive director of HAF. I floated around it as sort of an informal advisor for a time. I spent some time serving as an advisor to a funder in the space who was a significant funder of HAF. And so then I had still kind of an informal advisory role in that sense. And when the organization was ready to hire a new executive director, Sam had been doing this work since, for years when you consider the campaign and all of that, and was ready to take a much deserved break. Um, I originally was just kind of sharing my thoughts with them about the type of person I thought they should be looking for, the type of experience that they needed, what, the direction that the organization should be looking toward. And then I kind of Dick Cheney'd myself into the role. I sort of realized at some point during all of that, oh, I think I want to do this. I love this organization. There's so many things happening in the psychedelic space, but this was something that everything that I had done in my past came together to support this. The drug policy work, the political work, the policy work, all of that, the communications, the cannabis work, all of that policy work, like all of that really was a phenomenal foundation for taking an organization that was already doing incredible work, thanks to Sam and to Heidi Pendergast, who's the state director in Oregon, and Tasha Poinsett, who's the Colorado state director, and the lobbyists and comms people that were already on the team. They were doing great stuff. And I knew that I could come in and just help level it up one more bit with some support. And so I kind of took myself out of the counseling role and said, you know what, I'm throwing my hat in the ring, and, went through that whole process, and came on officially as executive director 1st of May last year. So I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary.
Congratulations. Yeah. Incredible organization. You guys are doing such important work. And like you said, there's no one really to do this work if you guys aren't doing it.
It
So
is a very unmet need outside of Healing Advocacy Fund. And that's not a knock on anyone. It is literally there is no one who would have all of that expertise. And, even in Oregon, it took us some time to figure out, what is it that we want to be doing? What is the advice that we do have? How can we be most valuable? But now we have done this work in Oregon, continue to do a lot of really strong work there, both on the sort of government relations and regulatory front, and also on the sort of community building with people who are operators and providers within the space. In Colorado, we were able to learn a ton from the Oregon program, even before it launched, just understanding the pieces that made implementation complicated. And that informed how we wrote the ballot initiative for Colorado, so that certain problems we solved right off the bat and didn't have to come back to. So having that, those lessons learned was incredibly valuable. And now, just in the last week, well, literally 2 days ago, when we're recording this, the New Mexico governor just signed legislation in New Mexico to create a regulated access program there. It's a slightly different model, a little more limited, and very much integrated into the healthcare system there. But that's exciting too, that we get to see the similarities and differences and the opportunities and challenges that come up when you do tweak something and make it, a little bit different. And so I really see HAF's role. My shorthand is we support the success of the state programs. What we really do is serve as a bridge and translator between the psychedelic world and the mainstream policy world. And that's desperately needed too. That this is a space that has been driven by incredible activists. And much like cannabis, there's a little bit of a divide between those folks and the policymakers who ultimately will be critical to getting this right. So I love sitting in that translation space. The history that I have working on campaigns in purple states, very similar, taking democratic progressive policies and trying to translate them in a way that appeals to a broader mainstream population. That is the sort of underpinning of the work that we do. And then the day-to-day work is just deep, intense rulemaking engagement, developing best practices, bringing expertise to the table. All of that someone has to do in order to make these programs as well designed as possible.
Right, which cannabis, if we are going to go back and relate it again, a lot of the systems have been implemented poorly.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you guys are in this role, in this space. And I'm curious, how crucial is it for these first few markets to get it pretty good, if not great, to the growth of this?
I think the most important thing is to minimize negative outcomes. I think the potential for a bad situation to be disproportionately representative of the entire concept is very real. We are in a place right now where psychedelic therapy and that idea has been gaining a lot of traction, but could very easily be knocked back by one or a series of terrible stories. And so part of the critical work for these early programs is over-index on safety, to the extent that you can without destroying access. And that is a big thing that we're still working on, right? I think Oregon is probably too over-indexed on safety and is making it a little harder to be accessible. We made some changes in Colorado that we think help correct that balance. And we're actually hoping to eventually help evolve the Oregon system to reflect that as well. But it is really important that we not have that we create opportunity to do this safely and demonstrate that it can be done safely. Another really important thing coming out of these early programs is to get some kind of outcome data. And that's been a little bit of a fight in Oregon, but we're getting there. HAF, prior to my arrival, ran a bill in Oregon to help actually start getting some real data out of there, which I think is critical, even if it's just number of people served, because then at least you have a denominator so that if and when inevitably there are bad situations, there is perspective, there is proportion, and we can adjust policy to help deal with that. I think one of the other things that we're doing in Oregon is trying to foster conversation within the provider community around situations that have been tricky for them, sharing stories of how they have responded and how they've adjusted to account for those. So I think all of that sort of build up towards safety is going to be incredibly important. I also think it's going to be important to figure out, and I don't think we have the full answer yet, how to do this in a way that maintains viability for the providers, and some level of affordability for clients.
I mean, especially in our culture, it's such a hard balance to find, especially when you're adjacent to healthcare.
Yeah.
It is, it's a conundrum because the businesses need to be sustainable if people are going to operate them,
Right.
and they're going to be able to create the impact. So, yeah, I mean, how are you trying to find that balance?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think we're learning again a lot from Oregon about the cost factors and things like that. I mean, one of the things is that the raw number that people hear for what it's going to cost often takes people by surprise, but they aren't taking into account, first of all, the number of hours that a given facilitator is spending with a client. It's usually somewhere around 12 to 15 per overall session. That includes the preparation, the session itself, and integration. And at a therapist rate, that's easily $2,500 or more. Many people are doing it for less than that, but it still feels like a big chunk because it all happens at once, right? And I do think there are efforts underway to figure out ways to be more economical. Group sessions and things like that can help. Um, and it's true that in these early days, uh, the accessibility is not what it hopefully will be in the future as we scale this up, as cost efficiencies are found, and eventually someday finding ways to get insurance reimbursement and the goal, the holy grail of Medicaid reimbursement at some point. This is all down the line and it is going to take some time, but it is off there in the on the horizon. um, Interestingly, the New Mexico program was designed with, and we were not the ones designing this. This was a New Mexico driven piece of legislation, but it was designed with the idea of trying to open the door for at least state healthcare dollars to help subsidize the treatment. And that's why in that particular program, the clients will have to have a qualifying condition, and they've listed a couple. And the facilitators will have to be licensed healthcare providers. And there's still a lot to be defined about which licensed healthcare providers qualify. That's not delineated in the legislation. But the idea is if it is fully integrated within the healthcare system, then it's easier to create opportunity for state level healthcare dollars to be spent on, at the very least, the preparation and integration, if not the actual administration session. So I think realistically, affordability is going to continue to be an issue for some time, especially for people who truly cannot afford it. I think there are some people for whom the amount seems high, but in the grand scheme of things is probably a good investment for them in their mental health, or and helping them lower costs in other ways. But there are people who can't afford regular therapy, much less psilocybin therapy, and that's a lot of people. Getting to those folks is critical and is also not something that's going to be easy to make happen tomorrow. Um, we have to work toward it, um, and build on what's happening right now in these states.
Well, I'm really glad that you're at the helm for this, and it's a huge time for the movement. It sounds like something you're very passionate about, and I imagine that you envision working on for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, this is I have, because of the ways that my career has bounced around, I don't tend to stay in one job for very long. Um, just by the nature of the jobs. This is my first time as the leader of an organization. I've been in a number two role quite a few times. And this is this was an interesting stretch and challenge for me to, take on the role of leadership. And I'll tell you, it involves a heck of a lot more fundraising than I realized, which is probably the number one challenge and the number one difficulty for anybody running any kind of nonprofit organization. But beyond that, I believe so strongly in the work, that I believe so strongly in the need for the work and in the ability of this organization as it's currently structured to do it. And that is really beautiful.
I'm sure that that's probably the fuel that you need to be driven on the fundraising front, because I also loathe fundraising. I've had to do it quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is, that is the thing when I talk about fear. That is one of the things that is scariest for me, especially because of my need for external validation. Fundraising is a constant test of that, and you're going to hear no. And it's really important to not internalize that. And that's where you're exactly right, to focus on the confidence that what you are doing deserves support and is critical to accomplishing the things that we as a field want to see done. That's got to be the underlying animation of fundraising efforts, as frustrating as they can be.
Yeah, I mean, as a donor, I like to be convinced that every dollar is going to good use, and you can give me ideas of how it's used, and I think that's pretty clear in this case. And so I really appreciate your effort and look forward to continuing to support it.
I appreciate that. As I said, I'm blessed with a very good team, and I know for as much of a sort of risk and challenge as it is to step into the executive director role for the first time, this situation is I'm so fortunate to come into an organization that didn't need to be fixed. It was just supporting the really good work that was already happening, and helping make that bigger. And I have been so lucky to have people like Heidi and Tasha and our communications director, Leslie, that do incredible work, that all I need to do is ask them how I can help them keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, that's it's a great feeling as a leader, for sure, when you've got people like that.
It is.
Well, to zoom out a little bit more, you've worked in so many different capacities, be it in politics, cannabis, psychedelics. You've certainly impacted so many lives over those years. And I'm curious, like, have you ever had an experience where like really hit you, like, wow, I really changed that person's life or changed these people's lives?
Hmm, it's a good question. I think I don't know if I have a, a specific person that I've had sort of like a one-to-one conversation with about this. And this is in some ways one of the challenges of working in policy is that you aren't the direct link, right? You're the kind of the step in between. Um, and and all of that said, there are so many incredible stories and examples of people whose lives have been changed by accessing this therapy, by being able to do this. That those are the people who are in my mind when things are hard with this. It's easy to get bogged down in the weeds of, did we get this language adopted that was critical for this rule that we wanted to make sure that we have, just the little bits of it
But
can
then
be.
seeing the stories that eventually,
Yeah, and that number, even just that 10,000 number in Oregon, and this 50,000 number that we could get to if we have the right support, that scale of impact is just as important to me. It's beautiful to see the individual stories and the individual impact, um, but there is the being able to take that and build it bigger while maintaining safety and the quality of the experience. That's the stuff that really drives me. That's the moving from the anecdotal to actually changing a system. I mean, that's how I ended up in policy, right? I fully recognize that in many ways I am not cut out for individual life changing.
yeah,
My mom was a teacher. I cannot fathom it. I cannot fathom how difficult, and I'm not
it's
built
like
for
gut
that.
wrenching.
I mean, parenting has been hard enough, and that's just one kid. um it is a situation where I feel like my abilities and skill set are most well suited to the work that I am doing, and I want to do that work so that the one-on-one life changers can do their work.
Yeah, a thousand percent. I totally get that, and yeah, I'm also kind of like the high level impact where like my wife is a nurse practitioner in bone marrow transplant, so she's like on the
Yeah.
ground changing
Yeah.
lives, and I think you way more so, but we're trying to impact on a scale, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
both are needed.
Exactly. Exactly.
So this is the point at which, if you'd like, you can ask me a question.
Okay.
But I prefer not to be asked about how I started the podcast, so that's come up.
Sure. Sure. Um, I think I'd be interested, from a philanthropic perspective, what are the things that are starting to happen in the world, whether it's drug policy or elsewhere, that get you excited, that you think are maybe new and interesting and or maybe even changing the way that you think about it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Um, Drug policy, certainly. I mean, I'm always happy to see that moving in the right direction. I would say, in general, like there's at least a segment of society that is embracing technology and the idea of abundance in society. Like for instance, there's with AI, there's a lot of fear on some sides, but then there's people that are looking at the best possible things it can do for us, and
Mhm.
those are the people that excite me. The people that talk about how lives can change. Not like freaking out about jobs that can replace, saying like, oh, if a doctor has a really qualified AI assistant, they're going to be able to spend better time with patients. Little things like that. And so that's kind of what I'm excited about right now in society in general, is just these new efficiencies that are happening that will hopefully make lives better, and hopefully that will people with better lives will be more empathetic.
Yeah, yeah, we shall see. I'm curious too. I need to do my own research on this a little more, but this, the concept of universal basic income often comes up in the context of these conversations, and the idea that, the fear pieces around AI replacing jobs are understandable given that our culture is completely built around the idea that you have to have a job in order to be able to function in society. And, and what does happen if there just isn't a need for that?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we're creating a world where people can afford to focus on things they're passionate about and creative with. I don't know what that's going to look like because there's so much similar to like with drug policy. There's stigma around having a job, right, or not having a job, and so UBI has come up a few times on the podcast before, and like I tend to consider myself to have libertarian values, but I also have this floor of like, let's take care of everyone just to a good floor and see how high that could get people in terms of what they can accomplish, the potential that they can reach. So it's kind of a balance there. But I think that we're going to have to do something, right?
Yeah.
So I hope that there's a beautiful way that can evolve, and I hope that it goes that way. There's certainly bad ways that it could go, but
Yeah, yeah. It is concerning to see all of this change happening at the same time that our political systems are as dysfunctional as I think they've ever been. Maybe that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly as dysfunctional as they've been in a very long time. Um, it's not necessarily the best soup to to pull good policy out of, but we can hope.
it's true. Yeah, I like to think that the good people are just, they're leading the charge, they're doing their thing and going to push the right things through. But, that's us being hopeful and naive perhaps, but we'll see. All right, so the next big one is, aside from family, what are you most grateful for and or most proud of in your life?
Wow. I think my answer would in some ways be the same thing for both, which is that I am grateful for and now proud of having to really spend time on my own mental health in the last several years. I am grateful in the sense that I was in some ways forced to. Um, and you will probably relate. Having a kid will really change a lot about your own kind of personal situation. And I think it's very difficult to ignore or to continue to repress things once there's a child that is both just sapping your resources more generally, but also someone that you're in constant thought about how you want them to experience the world.
And they're going to model you.
Yeah. And I experienced something akin to delayed reaction postpartum depression. And it actually, as it turns out, is apparently not that unusual. And I feel like this is something that more people should know. Mine didn't come on until I stopped nursing, because your body goes through insane hormone shifts, before and after. And so, there's all this focus on postpartum in the first 3 months, and I was okay in the first 3 months. But 7, 8 months in, when I tapered off and stopped, um, things got really out of whack, and not in a I couldn't get out of bed, couldn't go to work kind of way. And so in some ways it was easy for me to just assume that I was just stressed. It took me about a year before I was really ready to talk to a therapist for the first time in my life. This was not something that I had ever done. This was not something that was prevalent in my very small town in Southern Virginia, nor in my family. And having my son both biologically and emotionally forced me to do that. And I am so grateful. I feel like the amount of growth that has happened for me over the last, gosh, I guess it's 5 years now, um, has made a huge difference for me. And serendipitously has also plugged very nicely into the work that I'm doing. I have a much better understanding now of what mental health care is about and how it feels to be stuck in these cycles of challenging thinking, and how hard it can be to break out of them. Um, and I'm proud of it because it has been hard work. It has forced me to acknowledge weaknesses or vulnerabilities in a way that I was not comfortable doing in the past. And it has made me such a better parent. I feel it is, parenting is so hard. And I'm sure I'm making a million mistakes a day, but I see ways in which I have built some emotional communication between myself and my son that I never would have even thought to do. I wouldn't have understood that it needed to be done if I hadn't been plunged into all of this. So I'm incredibly grateful for it and incredibly proud of it.
Thank you for sharing and for the vulnerability. I agree with you. Like talking about how hard motherhood can be and how hard things can be postpartum, even on a delayed basis, is really important to have in the conversation. And I think in general as well around parenting, like parents knowing other parents are real and deal with the same gloves. You're not a bad parent because of this difficult situation. Like, yeah, every parent I think has those moments where like, God, am I doing a bad job? Like, but yeah, usually it's not the case.
It's funny because a lot of it is, really wanting to create space for my son to feel his feelings, which was something that I just didn't. I don't think my parents actively attempted to suppress it, but it just wasn't done. And I learned earlier than I can remember. I learned not to do that. And so I've been trying to give my son all this, space to do that. And for a long time, especially in those like 3, 4, 5-year-old years, I was like, I don't know if this is doing anything other than allowing him to be way more rude to me than I would have ever been to my parents. And I was just like, am I making a horrible mistake? But actually in the last year or so, as he's gotten a little bit older, I really am starting to see, the benefit. And there's still times when I'm like, man, I wish that you would just not express that feeling right now. But he is so much more aware of the feelings that he's feeling and comfortable telling me about them than I ever was, as a
Makes such a
kid.
big difference in the long run. I mean,
I hope so. I
being a
think so.
parent definitely makes you think back to how you were raised a lot in the mental health aspects. I mean, at least for me and you, it sounds like the mental health aspects of it. And so even when we like feel like, oh man, was that bad? Like we're being conscious of it. Like we're like, oh, should we change how we do this next time? And like, not at a fault to my parents. They were great parents. It wasn't thought of back then. So.
Yeah. And it's exhausting. I've often said that parenting while in therapy is a real mind. Yeah, I don't know how you feel about profanity on this show, but yeah, real mind fuck. Because you're doing all this digging into like how are the ways that I was raised, how are those manifesting themselves in some of the things that I'm struggling with now, at the same time that you're now the person raising someone and thinking, oh no, which is that conversation going to come up in therapy 25 years from now? Maybe.
But we're thinking about it.
But we're thinking about it. It just can be a little exhausting to be thinking about it all the time. But I am starting, like I said, I'm starting to see now very real benefits to it that make me feel good about having pushed through some of those harder things.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of, to me, that's parallel with like how much work it is to have kids, and like over the year, like you're investing in their future, your future, having kids that hopefully want to hang out with you when they're older, like so it's worth the hard effort.
Yeah, it was just terrifying. Like the stakes are higher than it's like every minute to minute decision is not going to be the one that creates your child's life, and yet the stakes feel so high that it's hard to know when
you don't know which one is really.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Well, I guess hopefully that time when I really lost it doesn't imprint itself on his brain in the way that on all the positive stuff doesn't.
Yeah, I mean the way I think about it is like every parent's gonna screw up their kid somehow in some way or another. Nobody's perfect. But you just hope that like you screw them up in the least impactful, negatively impactful way.
Exactly.
So, and a lot of things, like when you say mess up, like a lot of things have pros and cons in terms of just like, it sounds like overthinking, overanalyzing can have pros and cons. So,
for sure.
Yeah. So no, I appreciate you sharing. I think parenting is a very important topic that doesn't get discussed enough.
Yeah. And I think you might have said that I was supposed to come up with something that wasn't about family, but it sort of ended up that way anyway.
Yeah.
I think, because the mental health aspects are so driven by that, but that is also just so critical to everything in my life. And yeah.
That's how life works. It all comes back to family, 100%.
Yeah.
So the last big question I ask everybody: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would you fix, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
Oh boy. Gosh. I this is not somewhat complicated. I if I could snap my fingers and change one thing in the world right now, I think it would be something around realigning our economic incentives to humanity.
Yes.
It's such a hard and complicated thing because there's so many different, complicating factors here, but somehow we've gotten to a place now where, obviously there's massive income inequalities and those are challenging, but also the economic incentives around not building for substance, but just building for stock value and sale. I think that has had such a compounding effect. I think about it in the context of my hometown and how the family that owned this company were much wealthier than anyone else in town, but only by a certain degree. They lived there. Their kids went to school there. They funded the YMCA that had all the community programs. Like they were invested in the community because they live there and they weren't so far removed from it. And I know that, there's been this tremendous amount of economic value that's been created by, this shift more toward investment vehicles, and we're starting to get way out of my area of expertise, and there are massive benefits to globalization, which I completely acknowledge, but it feels like we've gotten so out of balance, at least in this country, around producing something of value to humans versus producing something that looks valuable on paper. Yeah. And if I could snap my fingers and change that, it feels like there would be a lot of reverberating effects.
I mean, that sounds perfect. That's how I've been thinking for a while now. Is just, I think drug policy and criminal justice reform is like what really put me on this. But the incentives are so misaligned, and it's like, why can't we align prison incentives to get people actually rehabilitated and successful members of society, instead of like, there's prison models that are around having people in them, and it's wild, and there's so many. Yes, I don't know how we do that, but if we could change
magic
the
wand.
scales, right, with the snap of the fingers, the magic wand, if we could make these incentives align to where humanity in impacting it positively was just as important as profit.
Yeah. And and there are lots of individual efforts to try to do that. And that's a big part behind, a lot of the economic concepts. But it's hard to see when even a successful business is only really ultimately considered successful if it can exit, and if it can, and there's not
They should be sustainable businesses, right?
like
Not just if you can exit.
again, I know I'm being a little like simplistic here, but the idea of building a company that does a thing and does it well and is viable and supports employees and supports and throws off a profit that supports the people who started it and doesn't have to then be sold off in order to create the next billionaire, or I just that's the part that feels so out of whack now. And I wish that we could fix that.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I really appreciate you joining and being so open and vulnerable. It's makes the show a lot better, and I'm sure there are many people inspired by you and your work. How can people best support you and your impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So Healing Advocacy Fund is the organization, and it's healingadvocacyfund.org. I hate to be, blunt about it, but honestly, money is one of the most important things. We are fully nonprofit, fully philanthropic funded organization, and every little bit counts toward what we're doing. Beyond that, I think, particularly if you live in places that have one of these programs, Oregon, Colorado, soon New Mexico, and you have a personal story that you want to share, or you have meaningful information to bring to the table, this is a policy. Uh, this is policy progress that is happening because people are sharing their stories. This is a very human driven effort. This is not, to draw. There was a lot of that with cannabis as well, but there was also this undercurrent of like, we're creating an industry. There was tax revenue. There was, and there was criminal justice reform tied to that was much more significant than what we see with psilocybin and other psychedelics. But the reason that this will be successful is because people will step up and tell their stories about how this has changed their lives. That's what moves policymakers and regulators. That's what, keeps this, it continues to move this towards mainstream. And so that would be another way that I think it would be really people driven to support this work.
Well, hopefully we can spark some action, and thanks again for your work, and I look forward to continuing to follow it and staying in touch.
Thank you, Jeff. This was just a fantastic conversation.
Thanks for checking out this episode of People Are the Answer. For more information, go to peoplearetheanswer.com. Please like, subscribe, rate, whatever you can do on various platforms. We really appreciate the support. And if you're interested, check out my other podcast, The Late Game Podcast. You can learn more at thelategame.com. Thanks.